So I'm going to create now a folder here called modules. And inside that modules, we're going to create folders for the actual modules. So we can have, for example, the web server configuration. Let's call it web server module. And then we can have in the modules here, we can have another module, and let's actually call it subnet. So now we have prepared folders for 2 modules. And each module will have its own main.tf, outputs.tf, and variables.tf files. So we can go ahead and create those 3 files in here. And actually, I'm going to do it from a terminal because it's easier. And if you're working also in a Visual Studio Code like I am, you can actually have the terminal window inside instead of switching back to the operating system terminal, which opens up right away in the correct folder of the project. And I'm going to create those files from here because it's just easier. So let's go to modules and to web server. And inside here, I'm going to create main.tf. Then I'm going to create outputs.tf. And I'm going to create variables.tf. And now I'm going to switch to subnet and do the same basically. Main.tf, outputs, and variables. And now if we expand those, there we go, we have our module structure, right? These are now empty. We don't have anything inside, so we can start creating content in those files. But this is actually the structure, which is also very straightforward and very logical in Terraform, of grouping together your modules and basically structuring your whole project. So now, when we create modules and configuration of these modules here, we can just reference them from the main.tf. So we have an entry point configuration file, which is our root module, and then we have the children modules inside that we can reference from the root. So I'm going to close the terminal now, and we have the structure now. Now let's actually start extracting the configuration from here to individual reusable modules. So first, let's actually move the subnet configuration to a module. And there is one point about modules and when you're creating them. When you're creating a module, it actually should group a couple of resources together. So creating a module for 1 or 2 resources doesn't really make much sense. So with a module, you should actually be grouping something together and making an abstraction over it, right? To make a group of resources reusable, because you already have the resource for subnet, right? So creating a module just for one resource wouldn't make sense because you're not saving any code and you actually have more overhead. So just keep that in mind, that when you're creating a module, it should actually group at least 3-4 resources for it to make sense, right? So in our case, what we're going to do is that in our subnet module, we're going to actually extract the whole configuration of the networking. We're actually going to grab those 3 resources. So basically the subnet itself, the internet gateway, and the default route table and its association with a gateway. And obviously, if we were creating a new route table, then we would have a subnet association with it, and we would also grab that along. So in this case, I'm going to grab those 3 resources, and I'm going to move them. We're going to leave the VPC here, and I'm going to move them in subnet modules main.tf. And the way to actually use the module from another config file, in our case, we're going to be actually referencing and using that module in the main.tf of the root module is actually to make it completely configurable, because we have to pass in all the variables. So basically all the values that are set here should be passed in by the configuration that is referencing it. So all of these values are going to be replaced with variables. So the VPC IDs, obviously we're going to call them VPC ID, and we're going to replace that in all the occurrences like this. The other parts here we have already parameterized, which is again a good practice, especially if you want to modularize your project. So we have already done that, as well as here. And we can substitute the value here as well. As well as here, we're referencing a VPC, which is actually outside in the root module. So I'm gonna replace it with a variable. And we're gonna call it var.routes, or let's call it default route table ID. Right, we can leave the CIDR block as is, and this reference here, actually, AWS Internet Gateway, is of a resource that exists in the same module. So we don't have to replace that through a variable because we have that resource available in the same context. So we can leave this as is. We have to replace these ones because we don't have the VPC reference inside here. It's defined outside. So we have to pass that as a variable. So we can leave all the IP addresses, as well as we can leave the reference to a resource that exists in the same module. Great. So now we have to define all those variables inside that module in the variables.tf. So all these variable definitions must actually be in that file, right? Because having those values available in variables.tf doesn't actually work for us, right? It has to be in the same module. So I'm actually going to copy some of these variables. Let's actually see what we need. We need the subnet CIDR block. So I'm going to copy that in here. We also need availability zone and env prefix. I'm going to grab both and copy it here. I actually cut the subnet CIDR block because we only need it in the subnet module, but availability zone and env prefix, we actually need it for the web server as well. So I'm going to leave it here as well. And we have two new variables, which are VPC ID and default route table ID. So we're going to create those as well. And I'm going to close it. So now we have all the variables that we're referencing in the subnets configuration defined in the modules variables.tf file. So now that we have the configuration as well as the variables defined, how do we actually use the module, or how do we reference it from another configuration file? And the way we do that is actually using a module keyword. So we're going to write module, and then we're going to call this module something that we want. So let's actually call it myapp-subnet, and we're going to create a block. And now here we're going to need a couple of attributes. The first one is the source of the module. So where is this module actually living, right? And the source in our case is just a location or path to the folder of our module. And that is modules/subnet. So we are telling Terraform, we're defining a module here, and this is the name that we just decided to give it. And the actual code or configuration of the module actually lives inside a folder called modules/subnet. So Terraform will find the configuration files here, and this will be basically our module. And once the source is defined, now we actually have to pass in all those variables that we defined in here actually, right? So the values to those variables need to be provided when we are referring to a module. So if you're familiar with programming languages, think of it like defining a function with a bunch of parameters and then calling that function in here by passing in those parameters one by one as values, right? This is exactly what we're doing here. So let's actually set those variables one by one. So previously we had all these variables or some of these variables already set, and the way we provided values to those variables was actually through terraform.tf_vars file, right? This is how we were actually passing the or setting those variable values. Now, since we made it into a module, we have to define them in the module section. So let's actually set them one by one. So we have the subnet CIDR block. And now the subnet CIDR block value, we can actually provide it either by hard coding it like this, or we can also reference it from the tf_vars file just like we did before. So instead, we can do. However, this reference actually comes from the variables.tf in the main module, and I have actually deleted that from here. However, if you want to reference it from main.tf in the root module, we actually need that variable definition also in the variables.tf file in that module. So I'm going to edit back so that we can reference it. So basically now what we're doing is we're referencing a variable called subnet CIDR block that has to be defined in the same module where this main.tf is. So we have variables.tf for that. So it has to be declared here. And those variables then are set through the terraform.tf_vars file where we're just providing the values for all those variables. So this is how it works. We have the values, the actual values defined here that are set as values of the variables defined in this file. And then we're passing on those values, in this case, the subnet CIDR block, to the module subnet in here, which is also grabbing those values through variable references, which also have to be defined in the variables.tf. So we kind of have the hierarchy of variables and the references. And this actually makes sense when you have complex setup and complex infrastructure, and to make it modular, even though if it seems like an overhead for a small setup now. And the same way, we're going to actually reference all the other values that our module requires. So basically all of these values here, and as I mentioned previously, if we are going to provide them as variables ourselves, or we're going to reference them as values here, they need to be defined in this variables.tf also. So let's see the second variable, which is availability zone. Let's also reference it like this. Also from the Terraform tf_vars file, we also have environment prefix, which is also stated here. And then we have the VPC ID, which we can actually access from the resource because we have the VPC resource defined in this module. So we can do this. So basically, as you see, even though we have extracted a module of our subnet, the syntax and the concepts actually stay the same. So we didn't have to change how we reference the existing resources or how we reference the variables file values and so on. It's just that we have created another level of hierarchy within our project. And finally, we have default route table ID, which we can also reference from the VPC. And the attribute, as we saw previously, is default route table ID of the VPC object. So this way we're actually setting all the values. So these are the attribute names that we defined ourselves. This could be anything that we want. Let's actually close this off. And right here, so basically whatever we name the variables, these are going to be the attribute names of the module and the names that we're going to be setting here. And as I said, the values can be either hard-coded, so this could be a string with the actual block, or in our case, we're referencing the tf-vars values, or we can reference it from the resource object, like we're doing for VPC ID and default route table ID. And one thing that I forgot to do here is actually in the source, if we are referencing a module using a relative path, so basically relative to the main.tf file, then we have to specify it like this. So we have to say current directory, that's what dot is for, /modules/subnet. So without this, we will actually get a warning. So let's fix it right here. So we have this module declared here. However, because we have extracted all these resources, including the subnet resource, to its own module, the references are actually broken now. So if I scroll to EC2 instance, which is referencing the subnet right here, this will not work because we don't have a resource called AWS subnet with this name defined in this module, right? This resource is actually defined in another module, and we cannot access a child module resource like this. We can only access it through module definition, right? So we actually need to fix those references first so that this code can work again.